Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to AJ117, Introduction to Terrorism and Homeland Security. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. So this week's lecture is going to cover Chapter 12, where we're going to take a look at America's vulnerability to terrorism. And we're going to do that by not just describing the role of a couple of agencies, but also look at how they respond to either terrorism incidents or major incidents, different types of catastrophes, if you will. So let's go ahead and jump right into our lecture. We have a lot of content to cover. So here we go, Chapter 12, America's Vulnerability to Terrorism. So I wanted to start off with just a couple of not long case studies, and you can go back and look at these at your leisure if you want to. But we'll start off talking just briefly about the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant. So the 3 Mile Island nuclear generating station is located in Middleton, Pennsylvania. And a government study assigns a very low probability as to the success of a 9/11 style attack using airplanes to damage the reactor core and causing radiation to be, released or expelled, etc. And the study also assigned a low probability that such an attack could cause the release of sufficient radioactivity to harm the public's health and safety. Now, if you don't know anything about 3 Mile Island, there was a major incident at this location. And I have a little video that you can take a look at because there was, again, issues with the reactor. So take a minute and watch the video and think about our infrastructure, if you will, because we're going to talk a little bit about critical infrastructure, and we're going to define that. And nuclear energy is one of those critical infrastructures. And you can also look at another short study, which would be on the Chernobyl nuclear plant. Now, this is not located in the U.S., but they had a similar issue, I believe, to a greater degree than the 3 Mile Island nuclear generating station. So this is in Russia. And take a look at that video as well, because it's super interesting to see what happened or what can happen. So with that said, I used the term a moment ago, critical infrastructure. So what is or are examples of critical infrastructure? So ponder that while I kind of get into a little introduction. So I'm going to give you time to think about it. So you awake to the startling sound of one of your favorite songs as you roll over and you hit the snooze button. And come on, everybody does it. They hit the snooze button, so don't say you don't. And you desperately try to get a few more, minutes of sleep like we always do, but the song kind of reminds you of last night's maybe party or gathering with your friends at a local restaurant, etc. And as you embrace yet another day, the shrill siren of an ambulance whizzes by on a busy street below your apartment. And if you live in a house, just say outside your house. And you stumble from the bed to turn on the lights and move towards the bathroom, a hot shower, brush your teeth, a little bit of hygiene, etc., to start your new day. And you kind of think about, that you still have a little bit of a sore throat and a cough, and you probably may need to get that checked out the next time you can get in to see your doctor. A bowl of cereal, some fruit, and the sound of, a familiar beep, perhaps maybe a text message from a friend, etc., and your classes are about to start in an hour, and that's just enough time to swing by the ATM and get some money and maybe get some coffee. And on the way out the door, you send a quick email to your parents or to your friends, wishing them, hey, have a great day or happy birthday or whatever is going on. and you jump in the car. You really hope traffic doesn't suck, and because you have a meeting in the morning at your workplace or at school, and it's just another day, just like every other day. Think about your day. A lot of them are like Groundhog Day. If you've ever seen the movie, you kind of wake up and it's kind of like the same thing. We are very routine-y, most of us are, or routine-ish. But what if something was different? What if there was a big time catastrophe, if you will, or something that impacted that critical infrastructure? What if there was a 3 Mile Island nuclear issue? What if there was a Chernobyl nuclear issue? What if all the power went off in California, which is where I am, and it stayed off for a month? You got to kind of think about these things. So, this may sound like a typical day for a lot of people and a lot of students and a lot of young folks, or just even older folks like me. It's also kind of a excellent example of critical infrastructure at work. And really the kind of benign attitude that we all tend to have sometimes regarding the services that we get or that we receive on a daily basis. So, let's take another perspective. Each of the daily activities that I talked about requires some of that critical infrastructure, within the country that is generally taken for granted by a lot of people, like your water, your power, etc. So critical infrastructure are systems and assets that are so vital to the United States that the incapacity or destruction of these would have a debilitating impact on national security, economics, public health, or safety. And examples could include communications. I mean, think of it this way, and I know you're all, it's not going to happen. Well, you never know. What if all your cell phones stopped working because cell service was down for a month? And then we look at things like energy, water, and waste systems, healthcare, food and agriculture, critical manufacturing, those places that build things, banking and finance, transportation, and even information technology. Because all of these you need on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. And these they could be extremely debilitating should something happen to them. So each critical infrastructure piece relies on others. And the loss or disruption of all or part of one of these infrastructure sectors, if you will, and we'll talk about those, would have a devastating impact on this country because some of them feed into other ones. Does that kind of make sense? So again, the loss or disruption of all or part of one of these critical sectors would be devastating to all of us. The simple fact of the matter is that our society becomes, or as our society becomes more advanced and complex, the more we tend to rely on critical infrastructure to support our lifestyle and our existence. And we all have a lifestyle, we just do. The simple activities that we undertake each day could be interrupted, potentially for an extended period of time, wreaking havoc on the state or county where you live. And each critical infrastructure sector, again, relies on the others, just like the example that I talked about earlier. A failure in one sector could lead to a cascading failure in others, creating even a bigger problem. So the 9/11 terrorist attacks also highlighted the threat and vulnerability to critical infrastructure. So, federal, state, and local government agencies have recognized that this vulnerability and the impending threats posed by terrorist organizations have taken a number of steps to ensure that a catastrophe of this magnitude is reduced. And these measures are known as critical infrastructure protection, and they are a major part of what we call the USA Patriot Act, or the USA Freedom Act now, but the Patriot Act signed by then President George W. Bush. So again, in response to 9/11, a lot of roles for different agencies, specifically federal agencies, but even state and local, were established, and there was a national commitment to the prevention of terrorism. So we have this new kind of focus, if you will. So one of the strategies that's out there is the national strategy for counterterrorism. So clearly, the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon on 9/11 and the ensuing passage of the USA Patriot Act in 2001 changed our country forever. The attacks really did set in motion the development of new roles for federal agencies, as well as a national commitment to the prevention of terrorism. And indeed, the role of law enforcement changed dramatically, not only from thwarting crime and dealing with local criminals, but also preventing, deterring, and investigating potential acts of terrorism. So we have kind of a dual role now, if you will. And nowhere is the nation's commitment to preventing terrorism on the homeland, if you will, or in the U.S. more evident than in the national strategy for counterterrorism that was reaffirmed in 2011. So together with the USA Patriot Act, and we'll just use an acronym because there's quite a few of them in this particular textbook. So the NSC, the National Strategy for Counterterrorism, was focused on dismantling the Al-Qaeda network, and also to establish a broad, sustained, integrated plan to safeguard the United States and our infrastructure. So it's kind of like there's two parts to that plan. Now, a catastrophe, and we'll define those in a moment, can occur as a result of a natural disaster, something like a hurricane, a flood, an earthquake, or a tornado, etc., or from a man-made act, such as those stemming from let's say, a terrorist bombing or an intentionally set forest fire. So the coordinated plans and efforts designed to protect critical infrastructure and or coordinate and manage resources during an emergency are often similar. So for instance, we talked a little about target hardening. So target hardening a building or dam assists in deterring a terrorist attack, as well as strengthens the physical structure itself from, potential natural disasters, right? And techniques for safeguarding the general population from disease and dangers stemming from a major earthquake may be similar to those that are undertaken after a significant bombing. So now this kind of brings us to this term called the all hazards model. So based on what I just said, the all hazards model recognizes that there are aspects of planning and response that are common in many kinds of catastrophes and disasters, regardless of how they were caused. And hopefully that kind of makes sense. So these activities are similar, however, they're not identical. Actual disaster response by federal agencies to acts of terrorism is kind of divided into two distinct responsibilities: crisis management and consequence management. But by definition, I just want you to know that responding to a lot of these catastrophes or man-made incidents, if you will, they are very similar. They're not quite identical, but they're similar. But when you deal specifically, when we're talking about acts of terrorism, this is going to require crisis management and consequence management. So just to kind of clear it up, the all hazards model, just really short definition, it's a concept that there are similar aspects to planning and responding to a catastrophe or an emergency event caused by either a natural or man-made thing, right? So it's kind of pretty simple. And by definition, crisis management, we'll talk about that in a second, so I don't want to confuse everyone. Okay, so that's the all hazards model. So now we're going to kind of talk a little bit about the role of the FBI. Because in these terrorist incidents, there's going to be the FBI and there's going to be FEMA. These are two organizations that are under the umbrella of the Department of Homeland Security that are in fact going to respond to a terrorism incident, and they deal a lot with infrastructure. So we'll talk about that. So crisis management is handled by law enforcement, principally the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and this includes developing, coordinating, and managing a response to terrorist events that threaten to harm the national security of the United States. Now, that doesn't mean that local agencies don't plan, they do. But the larger role, the role of the FBI has a larger, broad base where, part of their job is to do just what I said. And the FBI, remember, is also the primary federal agency responsible for investigating crimes conducted by terrorist organizations and includes investigating the crime, terrorism, evidence collection, scene security, and other law enforcement activities. Now, that doesn't mean, again, that local or state agencies won't be involved, but the lead role is going to be the FBI. Now, working closely with a variety of federal, state, and local law enforcement partners, the FBI is the primary agency responsible for protecting the United States from terrorist attacks. So, and again, they work with federal, state, and local law enforcement partners. So the FBI also manages some of these larger programs. And these are programs that actually help to detect, investigate, and prevent terrorist strikes. So let's take a look at the different programs just briefly. So the first is the National Counterterrorism Center and the Public Internet Tip Line. So as we talked a little bit about in Chapter 9, the FBI is a major partner in the nation's effort to thwart terrorism through the analysis and sharing of intelligence information. Next, we have the Strategic Information and Operations Center, and they call it the SIOC. Again, there's a million acronyms, right? And this is a state-of-the-art national fusion center, and you should know what that is, located at the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. And it acts as a national-level clearinghouse to collect, process, and to put out or disseminate intelligence information about terrorist threats and different incidents. And it also provides real-time information to those Joint Terrorist Task Force, remember, that are under the FBI, and those task force have they liaison with local agencies, and we knew the definition of that from last chapter. Next, we have the counterterrorism fly team, and it's not fly in the sense of how you probably think it is. So the FBI maintains a small but highly trained group of terrorism first responders, including field agents, SWAT personnel, intelligence analysts, Middle East experts, bomb techs, and hazmat personnel. And they are readily available to respond to any terrorist incident worldwide. Now, although their primary mission is to quickly respond to domestic emergencies, most of their deployments have been overseas during the last several years. So it's one of those kind of ready teams that can go anywhere in the world whenever they're needed. And then the last group or program would be the most wanted terrorist list. And historically derived from the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, the most wanted terrorist list highlights the 10 most wanted terrorists. That kind of makes sense. And all individuals on this list have been indicted and or are wanted on a terrorism-related crime stemming from an international or domestic terrorist event. Now, Osama bin Laden, as well as other Al-Qaeda leadership members, have been or were members of this particular group that were listed in that most wanted terrorist list. So that was, the role of the FBI. Again, and I know that you probably think of the FBI, well, they wear suit and ties, and all they do is push a pencil, and there's several other units that comprise the large agency of the FBI. So a lot of these agencies, federal agencies, they have a lot of subunits, which I think you're starting to see a little bit. So that's, the role of the FBI. Now we're going to talk about the role of FEMA. So if you remember, I talked about, actual disaster response by federal agencies to acts of terrorism is divided into two responsibilities: crisis management and consequence management. So I'm going to back up real quick just for a second. And crisis management is handled principally by the FBI. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the FBI and what they do, and now we're going to talk about the consequence management. So that's going to be the role of FEMA. So on the other hand, consequence management, or it's dealt with or managed by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. And it includes a lot of different things. It includes search and rescue operations, sheltering and caring for affected persons, debris removal, and mitigating damages after an event. So when you have to kind of think about that. Now, FEMA does a lot of training and preparatory training and things like that to help you be aware of certain things, etc. But typically, they're going to be a consequence management, which means it's going to be after the event. So they're going to come in and they're going to help. And it's going to involve, like I said, search and rescue, sheltering and caring for individuals, a lot of times debris removal, and then mitigating damages after an event. And this is an effort to reduce loss of life and property by lessening the impact of a terrorist attack or a natural disaster. So remember, it can be one or the other. So mitigation, that term it means an effort to reduce loss of life or property, lessening the impact. That's what the word mitigation means. And there's a lot of roles, again, things that FEMA will do. Now, kind of continuing on with the talk about FEMA. According to the Department of Homeland Security, talking about FEMA again, even though it's after the disaster or after the attack, There are also some instances in which FEMA will actually deploy, do things, respond before the incident. So, again, although FEMA is the key federal agency for the emergency management of a terrorist attack or natural disaster site after the event, there are some roles that they take prior to the event, but typically it's going to be after. So I don't want to, kind of confuse you on that. And there are also several other agencies that have specific roles in responding to and recovering from a disaster. So, for instance, the coordination of local relief agencies, food banks, shelters, and similar fall within the FEMA management guidelines, while specific responses to public health issues, say from open sewage lines, biological agents, or even radiation may be more appropriately handled by another agency like the Center of Disease Control, the Environmental Protection Agency, or even the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So there are other agencies that kind of help out. So again, FEMA does do a lot of things before, but typically they come in afterwards. So I think I've kind of stressed that enough now. And again, it can be fires, and we've seen the role of FEMA coming in after large fires, specifically the wildfires that we have in California. We've seen them come in and work after earthquakes, even those that are, you can look at the Hawaii, where they have like a lot of lava going over the streets. So it could be volcanic eruptions. It can be flooding. So all of these are going to be dealt with or responded to by FEMA along with other assisting agencies. And then earthquakes as well. So you can see they have a lot of, and just kind of one last thing to throw in there. So if you look at that awesome looking gentleman in the upper left corner right there, yeah, that's me. And it was a few years ago, not too long ago though, where I was involved in a Homeland Security and FEMA mission that went to Haiti after the devastating earthquake in Haiti. And I was there to help out any way I could. Kind of a funny story. I have a couple years of dental school under my belt, so I was there to help out both medically and with other individuals to help deal with cleanup, injuries, food supply, etc. So these are all photos that I took when I was there in Haiti. So you can even volunteer a lot of times for FEMA missions, if you will, to go to certain places to help after devastating catastrophes like the earthquake that was in Haiti. Okay, so continuing on with the role of FEMA. And we talked a little bit about mitigation. So again, this is the effort to reduce loss of life and property by lessening the impact of a terrorist attack or a natural disaster. And the Department of Homeland Security, is taking action before incidents to reduce human and financial consequences, as well as, responding effectively after the event. So again, it's just kind of a little bit of summary of what we've already covered. Now, FEMA has responsibilities to do several different things, to coordinate local relief agencies, food banks, and shelters. They also coordinate with other agencies, as we said a moment ago, dealing with things like open sewage lines, biological agents, or radiation, again. And those might be assisted or taken care of by assisting agencies like the CDC or even the EPA. Now, FEMA is also to protect the essential resources and facilities through a systematic plan of identifying vulnerability assessment and security preparedness. So this is known as the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, NIPP. And again, there's 10 million acronyms, right? So the NIPP, the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, was established in 2003 under Presidential Directive 7 and charged with defining a framework to coordinate an approach of identified critical infrastructures and then figuring out how to protect them. And that kind of makes sense, right? So initially, 13 critical infrastructures were identified and several key resources were determined to be potential targets for terrorists. So if you wonder why I put the CI and the KR, again, because these are acronyms. So the acronym in reference to critical infrastructure is CI, and the acronym reference to key resources is KR. So as we kind of go through the rest of the chapter, if I start to say those things, then those should pop into your head just to kind of keep you on track. So in 2013, however, President Obama extended this National Infrastructure Protection Plan to 16 critical infrastructures instead of the original 13. So now there's more. So that makes it pretty simple. And this was done under Presidential Policy Directive 21 and the Critical Infrastructure and Resilience Directive. So that's another plan that actually kind of came about. And this directive consolidated, again, the key resources category into sectors of their own and produced a total of 16 critical infrastructure programs. So, okay, what are they? Now that we've talked about them, there were 13 to start, now there's 16. That's really all you need to remember. But what are these different infrastructures? Well, here's kind of a little diagram of them, but we're going to look at each one. So it's going to be, and I'll go through them and then we'll kind of go back and we'll just touch on them briefly. So we have the communications sector, and we have emergency services sector, the energy sector, the dams sector, nuclear sector, water sector, chemical sector, commercial facilities sector, the healthcare and public health sector, the food and agriculture sector, critical manufacturing sector, transportation sector, government facilities sector, banking and finance sector, defense industrial sector, and information technology sector. And I bet you didn't know that there were really that many. So these are all listed in the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, in that NIPP, because they are all deemed critical infrastructure. And we define that at the very onset of this chapter. So let's take a look at them now. So each sector has a designated federal agency or agencies, there's one or more, that serve as a sector specified agency and is charged with coordinating and securing that sector from a terrorist attack or a natural disaster. So here's an example to try to get everybody on the same page. The Environmental Protection Agency, this is the agency, the sector specific agency, is the SSA, the sector specific agency for the chemical sector. So remember, we go back to chemical sector. Let's see if we can find it. There it is. So that SSA for the chemical sector is going to be the Environmental Protection Agency. And you're not going to have to know all of these, but it's good that we understand them, that some agency or group is actually, in charge of them, right? So what are those? So the first one we'll touch on is the communication sector. And the reason that I put it in bold back here, and now we'll go back here, is because telecommunications was the first infrastructure to be identified as critical. So they see it as one of the most important, if that kind of makes sense. Because really, without any communications at all, you're really not going to get anything done. So this was the first infrastructure to be identified as critical. And this was kind of brought about or identified by the things that happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the Cuban Missile Crisis required a letter to be written between President Kennedy and Russia because secure telephone lines didn't exist at the time. So, as a result of this, and I have a little link if you want to go and look a little bit more about the missile crisis, and we don't have a lot of time to cover it, but you can do that on your own. But as a result of the issues that were identified that happened here during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the 1963 National Communication System was created. So we started to see that we had this issue with communications. And we're still under the communications sector. And, as a result, the National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee was formed, and this was formed in 1982. And today it's comprised of 23 members of organizations, and it's charged with ensuring national security and emergency preparedness. And the communications sector incorporates a lot of different technology and services. So it's not just telephones. It's services like wireline or wireless, satellite, cable, broadcasting, the internet, undersea cable, telecommunication utility provided and service integrators, equipment vendors, and the members' respective trades associations. So there's a lot that falls under that communications sector. And the communications sector, it protects some larger kind of entities, if you will, which would be the Federal Communications Commission, the Department of Commerce, and the Department of Justice. And also information sharing at local and state levels through public utility commission. So again, this all falls under the communication sector. So next would be the emergency services sector. And the emergency services sector is the first line of defense in the prevention and mitigation of risk from terrorist attacks, man-made incidents, and natural disasters. And it also includes state and local first responders. So law enforcement, hazmat, search and rescue, explosive ordnance disposal, SWAT teams, aviation, and also 911 centers. So that kind of falls under the emergency services sector. And when we talk about law enforcement as it relates to, or emergency responders, if you will, as we talk about it under the realm of terrorism, we do have to understand something that I'm going to talk about in a moment called secondary device. So I have a couple of pictures here just to show you of groups that would fall under the emergency services sector. So, again, it could be fire with hazmat. Could be local law enforcement, it could be bomb disposal, it could be special weapons and tactics. Now, the reason I brought up the secondary device is because terrorists now target first responders with secondary bombs or devices. And they are typically hidden and set up to detonate when the first responders get there. And hopefully that kind of makes sense. So even though there'll be a first device, most people don't think about, well, there could be a second one. So everybody moves in to deal with the results or the aftermath of the first device. And then there's a hidden secondary device. So we have to kind of keep that in mind. And that was the case, actually, of the Olympic Park bombing. So if you remember the Olympic Park bombing, that was carried out by Eric Rudolph back in 1996, was the first example of the use of a secondary explosive device in the U.S. And Rudolph, an active member of the Army of God, a right-wing Christian identity movement, set a secondary explosive device aimed at killing or maiming emergency personnel that were first arriving at the scene. So we're starting to see a little bit more of that. So just, keep that in mind when we talk about emergency services, etc. So now what about the energy sector? So the energy sector, while it's its own sector, has three subsectors: electricity, petroleum, and natural gas. And the electrical, or the electricity portion, subsector, is the largest and also poses the most significant vulnerability, because the system is interconnected and managed by several electrical power grids. And you may know that because sometimes in your lifetime, maybe you at work or even at home, we've all experienced, let's say, a blackout where all the electricity goes out, or a brownout where only certain areas electricity is going to go out, because there's certain power grids. And each grid serves a specific region of an area, with the secondary grid responsible, as a primary or kind of a backup. And when electric power is interrupted or stopped, then you get that blackout. Does that kind of make sense? So by definition, the electrical power grid is a system of interconnected electrical processes serving regional areas within the U.S. A blackout is a loss of electrical power, and a brownout is a drop in electrical voltage in specific areas. So those are just kind of a couple of different definitions. If you have not watched the American Blackout movie, it's very interesting to see what happens to individuals. And this is a recreation, but it's actually pretty cool on how people kind of get stressed out and pressured, etc. People start to steal and do all kinds of things when they don't have electricity for a certain period of time. So take a look at that if you have a chance. Now, the subsector, remember we talked about electricity, petroleum, natural gas, those subsectors of the energy sector. So the petroleum sector includes the entire life cycle of oil, from exploration to extraction to storage, transportation, refinement, and also transmission, meaning like giving out or taking, distributing. And this includes the lines, the facilities, and also the docks. And threats impact the physical security of the United States, but also impact the price of oil on the worldwide market. So threats and attacks can also, kind of occur outside of the United States. And you've seen gas kind of fluctuate, right? And it's not necessarily based on a terrorist incident, but it could be based on production or an oil facility catching fire, exploding, different things like that. So now let's talk a little bit about the dams sector. So dams are included in the National Inventory of Dams, and I bet you didn't know we have that, and maintained by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Now, initially built to protect agricultural operations, that's typically what dams were initially built for. And so, things like dikes, embankments, or walls specifically constructed to regulate water. So when you talk about like levees and dams, these are dikes, embankments, or walls specifically designed or built or constructed to regulate water, which is what you'll see there. And a lot of them also are going to regulate water as it relates to power. Now, flooding from Hurricane Katrina and also Rita led to the National Levee Safety Act of 2007. And this required basically remediation of all the levees and dams that are old, in ill repair, And there's no real master list of levies. So, and you kind of think about that. Maybe there should be, because a lot of times these smaller levees, if you will, these embankments, they tend to break or give way or be prone to leaks, etc., more than a large dam would. Okay, and most dams are privately owned, but regulated by state or tribal governments. So now the nuclear sector. So nuclear power provides 20% of electricity in the United States. And there are over 100 nuclear reactors and over 60 nuclear power plants in the U.S. And I just kind of want to throw this out there to see how well anybody's paying attention. The picture in the bottom right, can anybody tell me where that is? So shoot me an email or something and tell me if you know where that photo is, because that photo is actually my favorite surf spot as well. So we'll see if somebody can figure that out. So I have a little chart here that talks about where all the U.S. nuclear reactors are at. So you can kind of look at this little thing right here and kind of show you where they are. Again, talking about the nuclear sector. In red, we have the in service, those that are active, the nuclear power plants. And then in the yellow, we have decommissioned, meaning like they no longer service, etc. So also under the nuclear sector are the manufacturers, the radioactive materials used in medical, industrial, and even academic settings, disposal of nuclear and radioactive waste, nuclear fuel cycle facilities, and decommissioned power plants. So you can see where they actually put some of this stuff. They're either going to bury it in certain disposal sites, or they're going to put it underground in these large underground areas. Kind of scary, right? When you think about that. Now let's talk about the water sector. So the water sector includes drinking water and wastewater utilities. Bioterrorist and chemical attacks using relatively small quantities of toxic chemicals or biological agents could cause a massive contamination. Because to be honest with you, when you go around, when you're in your own city, you'll actually find water basins or water areas that your city water folks will access, etc. And that's where the main meters are at, and where your water goes through, etc. And there's not much guarding those particular areas. And think about it, if somebody put something really bad in the water, how many people could actually be impacted by that? I mean, approximately 84% of the U.S. population is supplied by 160,000 public drinking water systems. And there are more than 16,000 public wastewater treatment systems. More than 3/4 of the country's population has their sewage treated by these wastewater treatment systems. So you could see if there was an interruption in one of these, it could be catastrophic. Now we'll talk about the chemical sector. So the chemical sector generates hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue. And it's going to include 5 main segments: basic chemicals, specialty chemicals, ag or agricultural chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and then finally consumer products. So a little bit more, the majority of the chemical sector is privately owned, and the Environmental Protection Agency and HAZMAT are primarily responsible for the chemical sector. And kind of an interesting thing, when we talk about chemicals, we can talk about the World Trade Center bombing in 1993. So Nadal Ayad, a naturalized Palestinian, was a distinguished student at Rutgers University who studied chemical engineering. And Ayad, because he was a follower of radical Islam over time, he ended up he stole the chemicals needed to make the vehicle bomb for the World Trade Center bombing in 1993. And here's a picture of what happened. Now we'll talk briefly about the commercial facilities sector. And this includes 8 different subsections. And we're not going to go too far into the subsections. I'll just tell you what those subsections are. So this would be entertainment and media, gaming facilities, lodging, hotels, etc., outdoor events, public assembly, real estate, retail, and sports leagues. All of those are subsections under the commercial facilities sector. Now, the healthcare and public sector is one of the largest, mostly private, and produces a large percentage of the United States economy. And it consists of hospitals and clinics and medical research centers. And this sector has a significant role in response, mitigation, and recovery to natural disasters or even terrorist events. You can think back, if you're old enough, to the anthrax attacks of 2001, when individuals were mailing around that white powder in the envelope, all the anthrax. Here's a couple of examples or evidence of anthrax that was actually mailed to a senator. And if you don't know what anthrax is, it's basically a spore-forming bacterium that is often weaponized or genetically altered to make it more deadly. And a couple of other deadly things that you've probably heard of would be ricin, an easily made and extremely toxic poison refined from castor beans. Now, this is actually 10 times more poisonous than anthrax. And then Ebola, often fatal disease, transmitted to people from the fluids of wild animals and spreads throughout the human population via direct contact via body fluids. So just to kind of show you, you can look at anthrax, just show what some of this stuff looks like, Ebola. Now we'll talk about the food and ag sector. So this includes things like farming, breeding, production, processing, and delivery of agriculture and livestock. About 1/5 of food production in the United States is exported to foreign countries. And crop production in the United States alone accounts for nearly $200 billion of gross domestic product. So again, if this were to be damaged or attack on our ag systems, you could see how bad that could be. The critical manufacturing sector includes the manufacturing of things like metal or machinery or electrical, transportation, and railroad. It employs a little over 11 million people and provides up to, or a little bit more, 13% of the gross domestic product. And attacks in this particular sector could have a cascading effect that could limit the ability to move goods, restore electricity, and basically, keep America working if we had an issue with our critical manufacturing sector. The transportation sector consists of, it has 6 subsections. And that would be aviation, highway, maritime, meaning out in the water, mass transit, pipeline transmission, and rail. And again, you can look at some pictures if there were mass casualties or huge interruptions to different transportation systems. And most people, when you talk about transportation and we talk about, the airplanes or aerial that fall underneath there, because remember, it's one of those, aviation, most people think, pretty much in terms of skyjacking or the 9/11 attacks. And skyjacking, by definition, is the diversion of a commercial airplane flight away from its scheduled flight plan. usually by violence or threat of violence against the passengers or crew. And that actually happened in 9/11, right? Where the one airplane was taken over by the terrorist, and some very brave individuals on the plane were able to bring it down in Pennsylvania before it reached its target. The federal facilities sector. So federal facilities alone cover more than 3 billion square feet, and another 90,000 municipal governments that maintain their own facilities. And government buildings are an attractive target for an attack, just like the Pentagon was. And the General Services Administration provided physical security for most federal facilities. The banking and finance sector, well, the main overseer of the banking and finance sector is, of course, the U.S. Department of Treasury. And the banking and finance sector covers things like deposit and payment systems, so the system that the bank uses, etc., credit and liquidity products, investment products, risk transfer documents, and accounts for all the monetary and fiscal assets of the government and the private sector. And then the defense industrial base sector. This is overseen by the Department of Defense, and that kind of makes sense, right? And this sector includes public and private industries that support military operations, or they might even contract with them, conducts research, development, and maintenance of military weapon systems, etc. So this is the defense industrial base sector. And the IT sector, interconnects and is relied upon by almost all, or pretty much all, the other sectors, right? IT kind of runs everything. The IT sector provides data coordination and communication during a natural disaster or a terrorist attack. And the IT sector is described as kind of the ties that bind. And as such, the IT sector itself is a target of terrorist attacks. And the phrase information warfare or informational warfare is using, the using of IT to gain a tactical or strategic advantage over an opponent during a conflict. And this will include physical assets, virtual systems, and networks, both, public and private. So companies like Apple, Boeing, JP Morgan Chase, Google, eBay, Raytheon, Cisco, and Microsoft are a few examples of those larger organizations in the private sector that would fall up underneath the information technology sector. And DHS, Commerce, Energy, Defense, and the National Institute of Standards and Technology are some of the federal agencies that are also found under the IT sector. Okay, so a lot of information to cover. We made it actually just under the 60-minute mark, so that's good. So I hope we kind of gained a new understanding about some of those, not just, an overall understanding of America's vulnerability to terrorism, but also what some of those critical infrastructure pieces are, and what things would be like if in fact one of those were to be destroyed, etc. So with that said, that will complete or conclude our Chapter 12 lecture on America's vulnerability to terrorism.